Senator Yield.
Yes, I will yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
I would ask the gentlelady, does her bill include part-time workers? In other words, people that don't work full-time?
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, I would say to the gentleman from Fairfax City, my bill does not make a distinction between part-time or full-time. It merely states on line 65 through line 68 that if you work 30 hours, you earn 1 hour
Further question,
of paid sick time.
Further question, Mr. President.
Senator Yield. Senator Favola, you yield?
Yes, Mr.
Senator
President,
Yields.
I yield.
In other words, if someone comes into my office and works 1 day a week, 8 hours, out of the 168 hours a week, and the other 160 hours are on their time, they can then claim sick leave for the 8 hours that they're in my office.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, I would say to the gentleman from Fairfax City, the accrual of time does not start until they've actually worked the 30 hours, and then they're not vested until they've been with the company 90 days. So after 90 days, if they start, they can start the 30-hour to 1 hour
Further
ratio.
question, Mr. President.
Senator Yield.
I yield, Mr. President.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
So once they have vested and once they've accumulated the 30 hours and they work for me 8 hours a week and the other 160 hours are their free time and they need to take a child to the doctor's office or what have you, they can use the 8 hours they're working for me to run that errand as opposed to the 160 hours that they have of their own time and be paid for it.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, I would say that being the generous and kind individual that you are, I would expect you'd have some paid time off policy, which would probably accommodate this.
Further question, Mr. Chair.
Senator Yield.
Mr. President, I yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
You're aware that, for example, under the Affordable Care Act, we make a distinction between full-time and part-time, that benefited employees typically get benefits such as health insurance once they work full-time, which is defined as over 30 hours a week.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, I would say I am aware the purpose of this bill is to pick up the many individuals who are wage workers and are not with companies that would allow them to take time off. We're really trying to reach, I guess through my examples I was not clear enough, we're trying to reach individuals who are employed in organizations that would not offer paid time off under any condition.
Further question, Mr. President.
Senator Yield.
Mr. President, I yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
Is the senator aware that within our own legislative staff we have what's called a benefited employee and a non-benefited employee?
Senator's the floor.
Within our own staff.
Mr. President, I am aware that we do have that distinction, and they have to work fewer hours to not be counted under the ACA. I am aware of that.
Mr. President.
Senator Yield.
Mr. President, I yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
And the concept behind a non-benefited employee is that they have more flexibility of time, and it's also lesser cost to the employer because you don't have to pay them mandatory benefits.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, I am aware of that.
Further question, Mr. President.
Senator Yield.
Mr. President, I would happily yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
I would ask the gentlelady, are we putting a mandate on our own private businesses that we would not put on ourselves as state senators?
Senator's the floor.
Well, Mr. President, I would say I would not expect necessarily for that to be the case. Many part-time state employees are part of a paid time off policy because they're in a professional or semi-professional category. Again, if you have a paid time off policy, you would be exempt, but I do understand the point. I do not employ 15 employees in the office of Senator Favola. I am not aware of what the policy might be for the broader entire
Further
office
question,
of the clerk.
Mr. President. Gentlelady,
Yes.
yield.
Well, Senator
Yes,
Yield.
I do
Senator
yield.
Yield, you have the floor.
You may not employ 15 employees, but you understand that the Commonwealth of Virginia employs over 15 employees.
Yes, you mean the office of the Senate? Yes, I am aware.
And you would agree with me that your employees are actually state employees, so this policy would apply to them.
This policy would apply to again, if they worked those hours. That is correct.
Final further question, Mr. President.
Will Senator yield?
And you would agree with me, there's been no budget amendment to budget for this.
The budget amendment that has been submitted is for $200,000 to bring 2 individuals on the Department of Labor to implement this. This does not take effect until January 1, 2021, but I understand there could be a much larger state impact. It's indeterminate at this time, but yes, I am aware.
Speak to the bill at the appropriate time.
Let's do that now. Senator from Bedford, Senator Newman.
Mr. President, will the gentlelady yield for a question?
Senator Yield. Senator Yield, you have the floor.
Mr. President, following up on the questions from the senator from Fairfax City, were there any amendments placed into the budget this year as it relates to any of the agencies of the Commonwealth, not to administer it, but actually to pay for the actual leave time?
I would say to the senator from Bedford, I am not aware that there were specific budget amendments put in. I have been advised that many of our agencies, again, do have paid time off policies for part-time employees. Even though the governor did put a paid sick leave policy, he had a patron of a bill that was similar to mine, but of course not exact. I don't believe the agencies received any, I don't believe they submitted any extra money to actually implement such a policy.
Question.
Will Senator Yield? Senator Yield.
Yes.
Senator Yield, you have the
Mr.
floor.
President, would the gentlelady agree that it has been indicated to us that there are 8,600 state employees who currently are part-time and do not receive this type of benefit?
I would say to the senator from Bedford, yes, I am aware of that, but again, the information I got back was the cost would be indeterminate, and it could be a very large amount, and I concede that. Yes, this will have significant budget implications if it is implemented in its current form in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, if the gentlelady concurs that there's over 8,600 state employees that do not have a benefit that is this rich, would the gentlelady agree that our current budget has $0 for state police, has $0 for the museum systems, for the judicial system, for others to implement this? Would the gentlelady agree that in this case, we've told members throughout this entire chamber that if you have a $20,000 fiscal impact, you get the clause. This one has a multi-tens of millions of dollars impact, and there is no money in the budget. Would the gentlelady agree with that?
Senator has the floor.
For the implementation purposes associated with each agency and each agency's employees, yes, I would agree.
Mr. President, I thank the gentleman for asking questions. I may have comments at a later time, sir.
I would just take this time, Mr. President, to say that, again, the intent of this legislation is to send a policy statement to the governor. This legislation, in terms of its implementation framework, is not perfect. We are expecting the governor to make significant changes and probably address some of these things through regulation. I understand that the fiscal impact has got to be addressed.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hanover, Senator McDougal.
Would the senator yield for a question?
Senator Yield.
Yes, I will yield.
Senator Yield, you have the floor.
Mr. President, in reviewing the substitute, it appears at the beginning in that initial new code section 40.127.3,
Yes.
no employer shall discharge, which means fire, demote, or otherwise discriminate, which I would assume would be moved to a different role if they're absent from work for any purpose set out in the new section 40.33.3. And I'd ask the senator, as I read that, going down to section 1, 2, and 3 of that, it's so you cannot do any of those things if an employee does not show up for work because of a health condition. So I'd ask the gentlelady, if an employee is having trouble sleeping and showing up to work every day, are you able to move them to another place, demote them, or ask them not to continue in your employment?
Senators,
based
the floor.
on the way this section now reads.
Senators, the floor.
Mr. President, I would say, again, it would apply to those employers with 15 employees or more. I don't know how you would define retaliation. That might be something that would be defined in regulation, but it can't exceed 16 hours. And I would expect that individuals, when they are working part-time, are very intent on keeping their jobs. There have not been incidences where there was mass abuse of paid sick days, at least according to recent studies. I am not going to say it couldn't happen.
So, Mr. President, I'd ask the senator to yield for additional questions.
Senator yield. Yes. Senator yields to the floor.
Mr. President, I'd ask the senator. I'll withdraw that question, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Okay. Just really,
Mr. President,
Senator from Northern Fairfax. Senator,
we have serious concerns about the physical impact, so I would ask that this go by temporarily.
without objection.
No objection.
Without objection, Senate Bill 481 will go by temporarily.
Page 49, Senate Bill 588, second report.
Before, just very quickly, before we get to the next bill, we'll take up Senate Bill 588, page 49. We just wanted to just do a check-in on time and where we all are in the day. It's now 1:20 p.m. We have to get through